So now we're going to go from the cult to the occult. I'm going to go back in time a bit and realise not everything is as new as you thought it was. And this is called the British Occult Secret Service, the untold story. And since the time of Elizabeth I, British secret services have worked according to the principle of the end justifies the means. Money, bribery, blackmail, these are their recruitment methods, the seducement. And this was said by Nikolai Patrushev, who is the head of the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, back in October of 2007. So who are the British Occult Secret Service? Well, it's all in the letters. They could be the boss, British Occult Secret Service, or you take British out and you're left with OSS. They are the OSS, riddled with Jewish and Egyptian mysticism, as they call it. Satanicism, I would deem it. And it's not really surprising that historically occultism and espionage have often been strange bedfellows. The black art of espionage is about obtaining secret information, and they used witches, psychics, and astrologers have always claimed to be able to predict the future and know about things hidden from the ordinary people. And unlike the Catholic churches, they spoke to those people, the OSS did. The church declared them heretics and burned them all alive. Oh, what a holy and divine practices they have. Not. But gathering intelligence is carried out under a cloak of secrecy, and occultists are adept at keeping their activities concealed from sight. That's why they called it the mystery schools. A mystery to us. Well, no more. And like secret agents, they also use codes, symbols, and cryptograms to hide information from outsiders. And occultists and intelligence officers are similar in many ways, as both inhabit a shadowy underworld of secrets, deception, and also disinformation. It is therefore not unusual that often these two professions have shared the same members. Now, the father of the British Secret Service was the Elizabethan lawyer, politician, diplomat and spy master Sir Francis Walsingham. That was in the 1500s. Now, he was a Protestant, which is not a religion, it's a protesting movement. And as a young man during the bloody reign of the Catholic Queen Mary, was forced to flee abroad to escape persecution. And while in exile, Walsingham learned Italian and French and became acquainted with the work of the famous Venetian Secret Service that had used its spying skills for trade and commerce under the cloak of diplomacy. Well, I never. Sounds like the modern-day CIA. When Queen Elizabeth I was crowned, Francis Walsingham returned to England, and he was appointed as the secretary to the English ambassador to the French court in Paris, and also worked as a secret agent reporting back the intelligence he gleaned to Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State. This is not the current Queen Elizabeth, it was the previous one. Sir William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh. And between 1568 and 1570, Walsingham, who had become a Member of Parliament, worked in England under domestic counter-espionage, exposing Catholic plots against the monarchy. Faction fighting. And so 300 years after the Magna Carta, the monarchy had risen again, and the black nobility of Rome, represented as the church, was still playing faction wars, is what this is telling you, which is what the Magna Carta, the Great Cartel, was all about. The people have never been represented, as too many are all too content to allow rich people and elites to dictate for them. And that's what we have to change. Now, in 1570, Walsingham was appointed as the new ambassador to France, and he proceeded to set up his own network of undercover agents in France, Italy, Spain, and the Low Countries. And the late Cecil Williamson, who worked for British intelligence during World War II and later ran a witchcraft museum, told the writer that Walsingham had often used witches as spies. So in come the mysterious Dr. D. One of the famous occultists he is known to have recruited was Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer and the magical architect of the British Empire, the Welsh magician Dr. John Dee. Now, Walsingham was involved in the machinations for the proposed marriage of the Duc d'Anjou and also to Queen Elizabeth. Now, the Anjou is one of the 3 French family bloodlines that makes up the so-called British 3 lions emblem. Oops. And at the spymaster's personal recommendation, the Queen dispatched Dee to France with orders to report back on the progress of the marriage negotiations. And the Magus travelled to the Duchy of Lorraine and drew up the birth charts of both the Duke and his brother, who was also regarded as a possible husband for the English monarch, all in-house, as you can see. And Dr. D, probably influenced by Walsingham, diplomatically reported back to London that the stars had suggested a political alliance would be far wiser than matrimony, and the Queen took his advice. The astrology stars. Oh dear. No wonder so much of society went wrong back then. Relying on a science that has a missing component is pure folly, and yet it continues to this day. You cannot do astrology with one constellation missing. Pure folly, and I just don't wish to hear why a Venus with a silent P is in conjunction with Uranus, as that's far too much information for my liking. But in 1573, Sir Francis returned to London and became a Privy Councillor. And this placed him at the heart of the government, and he proceeded to set up what amounted to the first organised foreign espionage service to operate from England. In 1566, he had put in place a pan-European network of spies, extending as far to the east as Turkey and Russia, where Dr. D reported on the ongoings at the Tsar's court. So you see with this, the Five Eyes network goes back way further than people thought. Now, this network mostly gathered intelligence on the military activities of the Spanish, who were the lead royals at the time, and were also England's primary enemies as well. Now, Walsingham was also responsible for foiling the Catholic plot, whose exposure led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Who's Mary? using Dr. D's psychic powers. Ooh. And he was apparently able to discover that the plotters were passing secret messages to the imprisoned Scottish Queen hidden in bottles of wine. Now, while travelling in Europe in 1562, Dr. Dee had come across a book written by Abbot Trimethus of Spanheim, and this was a guide to writing ciphers and secret codes for magical purposes, and Dee informed Sir William Cecil about his discovery. And on his return to England, Dr. Dee adopted the abbot's cryptography and gave it to Sir Francis Walsingham for use by his secret agents. Again, we all thought cryptography was late 1800s or early 1900s. No, it was operating in the 1500s. And he also passed on the political and military intelligence he had acquired during his travels across Europe. And it has been alleged that Dee used the famous Enoch magical alphabet as a code to disguise this information. The Enochian magical alphabet as a code. Because if he had been arrested, his captors would not have understood it and dismissed it as nonsense. Why? Because this was off-world coding is why. Enoch was one of the Hebrew Anunnaki. And this is the coding that's used by Freemasons and Mormons, all based in the Egyptian Hebrew Anunnaki codes. Which is why Zecharia Sitchin was allowed to decode it in part, some truth and some diversion. Why? Because Sitchin was born to and died in, and was also an Illuminati member. You don't think they would tell us the whole truth, do you? The answer is no. Now, in 1587, Dee even claimed that he received a spirit message from one of his angelic contacts concerning a threat to the English fleet. You know, if it was modern time, Dee would be claimed as a conspiracy theorist. So Dee was a latter-day, pardon the pun, John Smith of the Mormon fame. Angelic contacts, yeah, right. Now, the message said that the group of disguised Frenchmen working for the Spaniards was secretly visiting the Forest of Dean. Now, the Forest of Dean was a royal hunting ground previously in 1066, and the word Dean meant an enclave of a group of 10 monks, all very decimal before its reintroduction. Why? Because 10 is the binary code, is why. Ones and zeros. Now, that forest was the centre for English shipbuilding, and the French agents planned to bribe disloyal foresters to burn it down. And Dee sent his supernatural intelligence to Walsingham and the saboteurs, who were masquerading as squatters, and they were arrested. Now, the information supplied to Sir Francis Walsingham from his European spy network convinced him that a Spanish armada would be launched against England in 1588. And he asked Dee to use his knowledge of astrology to calculate the weather prospects for an invasion. And the Magus told him there would be an impending disaster in Europe caused by a devastating storm. And when news of this prophecy, there is no prophecy, it's plan, was leaked and reached Spain, naval recruitment fell, and there were desertions of sailors from the Spanish fleet. Pro-pagan da. In Lisbon, an astrologer who repeated the prediction was charged with spreading false information. So you see, fake news is not something from the last few years. It was going on in the 1500s. And in an act of psychological warfare, Dr. Dee also informed Emperor Rudolf of Bohemia, the modern-day Czech Republic, and the King Stephen of Poland that the predicted storm would cause the fall of a mighty empire, which at the time was Britain. Now, Rudolf, who was an occultist and Dee's patron when he stayed in Bohemia, passed on the warning to the Spanish ambassador. Now, it is a fact that in 1588 a great storm did scatter the ships of the Spanish Armada in the English Channel, and that aided the English victory. And this meteorological event was popularly credited to a magical ritual performed by the buccaneer Sir Francis Drake on the cliffs at Plymouth. A magical ritual. Now, superstitious people at the time believed Drake was a wizard. Which one? And he also, they claimed that he sold his soul to the devil in exchange for success over the Spanish. If you dance with magic, you get burned. And it is claimed that he also organised several covens of witches to work magically to raise the storm and prevent the invasion. Yes, he danced with the devil, or the jinns. They perform the magic, light or dark, at great cost. Now, meanwhile, as a result of scrying in his shoe stone or crystal, Dr. Dee saw a symbolic vision of a castle with its drawbridge drawn up, which was England, and the image of the elemental king of fire. And as a result, he urged the Navy to employ fire ships against the Armada, and they did so with good results. Now, after Sir Francis Walsingham's death in 1590 and the ascension to the English throne of the Scottish King James, Dr. John Dee fell into royal disfavour. The new king had an unhealthy obsession with witchcraft, and his early reign was dominated by this preoccupation, which led him to employ the Secret Service in his own personal vendetta against suspected witches. Now, James I ordered its agents to hunt down alleged practitioners of witchcraft and expose their alleged plots against the monarchy. And one of those involved was the Earl of Bothwell, accused of high treason for organising a coven of Scottish witches, Scottish Rite, to work magic against the king in an attempt to seize the throne. Now, to assist his secret agents in their new witch-hunting activities, King James persuaded Parliament in 1604 to pass a new and stronger Witchcraft Act to deal with the problem. And the bill was rushed through, and it was made law within 3 months. It's funny how that works, isn't it? It's a bit like the American Congress for aid to Israel. It gets passed within 3 days. So you would think this practice of covens and witches influencing elections or power had ended. And yet we had the case of the Canadian coven connected to the Sisterhood of the Rose, whose organisation dates back thousands of years and back to the Sirius star system, known as the Scarlet Sisterhood, who were one bad bunch of evil, they were, and still are, as some are in their human form here. the Sisterhood of the Roses, the Scarlet Sisterhood. They were just about the most evil witches ever. Now, the Canadian Coven did witchcraft on Trump to influence an election. Yet, curiously, none of the agencies arrested them for threatening a standing president. It's funny how that works, isn't it? The next part is called Dashwood and the Hellfire Club. Some of you may have heard it. And in the 18th century, the Secret Service became concerned at the activities of the so-called Hellfire Club that was founded by Sir Francis Dashwood, later who became the Chancellor of the Exchequer and a close friend and political advisor of King George III. And as a young man, Dashwood went on a grand tour of Europe that was compulsory for aristocrats, and he was initiated into the Masonic Lodge in France. And whilst visiting Italy, he developed anti-Catholic views, violently broke up a celebration of the Mass and insulted the Pope. Sounds fair to me. Even though he was an aristocrat, Dashwood was disgusted at the vast wealth of the Roman Church compared with the poverty of its devoted worshippers. And why didn't he give some of his money to them then? Well, no, that's not how it works again. And he also became fascinated by classic mythology and decorated his country house at West Wickham in Buckinghamshire with murals, paintings and statues of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. Now, Sir Francis Dashwood founded a secret society called the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Medmenham, more popularly known as the Hellfire Club. So the Hellfire Club was a religious order that was named after the abbey he had purchased on the banks of the River Thames where its meetings were held. And rumours circulated in the coffee houses of London that the friars practiced sexual orgies featuring aristocratic ladies, and prostitutes were dressed up as nuns. There were also satanic rites such as black masses, where the naked body of a noblewoman acted as an altar. Altar means a sacrifice table, remember. However, according to one senior member of the Hellfire Club, this occult mummery was just an amusing diversion for the dandies. No, it wasn't. It was an orgy of sexual debauchery, blood drinking and sacrifice, ritual sacrifice, just like its counterpart, the Bohemian Grove. Now, the inner circle of the order was actually dedicated to the serious revival of the pagan Eleusinian mysteries and the worship of Bona Dea, or the Great Mother Goddess, the Kali Ma. Pagan, oh dear, from one hellfire to another, and if you will pardon the pun, we don't need their pro-pagan propaganda, which means pro-pagan skin. Now, Dashwood's present-day descendant, also called Sir Francis, confirmed this fact in a BBC radio interview some years ago, and it has been claimed secret agents infiltrated the Hellfire Club because of one of its many members, or many famous members, and they included the Earl of Sandwich, John Montagu, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty, Maritime Law, the Paymaster General Thomas Potter, several members of Parliament, the Lord Mayor of London, which then tells you these were all Crown agents, a son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Earl of Bute, who was the Prime Minister, and it was also being claimed even the Prince of Wales attended. And at least 4 members of the group were known to be actively involved in espionage. And there was a radical MP called John Wilkes, a transvestite French diplomat, Chevalier d'Eon de Beaumont, the American statesman and philosopher Benjamin Franklin, and Sir Francis Dashwood himself. Now, Wilkes had allegedly recruited the Chevalier into the British Secret Service, and during his stay in Russia on the Grand Tour, Dashwood had spied on the court of the Tsar through his close friendship with the Grand Duchess Catherine. In Italy, he gathered intelligence on the exiled Stuart dynasty, of which Princess Diana was one of them, and their supporters, although the head of the British Secret Service in Rome believed Dashwood was a Jacobite agent. In fact, he was only pretending to support the Stuart cause and was passing on information about their activities directly back to London. Now, in later years, Sir Francis and Benjamin Franklin were involved in a clandestine plan to reconcile the American colonists and the British government to prevent the War of Independence. Franklin, who is still revered here, was a Crown agent who worked for the Rothschilds. Well, I never. The next section of this occult is Rudolf Hess and the British occult connection, which brings it up to more modern day, particularly for the elderly club. And during World War II, British intelligence invited many occultists into its ranks because it needed their specialist knowledge and skills, and the Assistant Director of Naval Intelligence during the war was Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, best known later as a thriller writer and the creator of the famous fictional, they say, no, it was documentary, spy James Bond 007. Now, Fleming was also interested in astrology and numerology, gematria, which is Hebrew Anunnaki again. And he was a friend of the notorious magician and clown Aleister Crowley, who had worked for MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, during World War I, and in the 1920s and 30s spying on Germans with occult interests. And this was covered in a book, The Magus Was a Spy, by Dr. Richard Spence in New Dawn, back in 2007. For the American benefit of the Americans, MI5 is the domestic intelligence, a bit like the FBI, although we have Scotland Yard, which is also like the FBI. And MI6 is international. They're all clowns. Now, Ian Fleming conceived an audacious plan to lure a high-ranking member of the German government into defecting to Britain so as to provide a morale-boosting pro-pagan coup. Now, this idea had been inspired by a novel written by Fleming's brother Peter called The Flying Visit. And Peter Fleming was a journalist, and he also worked for both MI5 and the pro-pagan section of the clandestine Special Operations Executive, SOE. Now, the novel imagined that Hitler's plane crash-landed in England and he was captured, and the Reich Minister and Deputy Führer himself, Rudolf Hess, was chosen as a suitable candidate for the actual plot. Now, there was stories coming out of my hometown that Hitler landed in Liverpool, England, which has never been fully revealed whether it was the truth or not. Now, the reason for this was because Hess, like Hitler, was a supporter of peace with Britain. But he was also under the influence of astrologers and occultists, and it was believed that this could be used against him. Now, Commander Fleming recreated the Link, a defunct Anglo-German friendship society of the 1930s that had a wealthy membership of Nazi sympathisers drawn from the British establishment. And that is correct, because most of the cabinet in the British government at the time, the Conservatives, were Nazis and were often known to wine and dine with the Nazi elite during the war. Now, ironically, or perhaps coincidentally, the Link had been founded by Admiral Sir Barry Domville, who was an ex-director of the Naval Intelligence Department after he retired in 1930, and Domville was arrested and interned in May 1940 because MI5 believed he was plotting a fascist coup d'etat supported by aristocratic peacemongers. Now, the Admiral was a friend of Major General J.F.C. Boney Fuller, a famous military analyst who designed the tactics for the first tank battle in World War I. Fuller also invented the concept of blitzkrieg, which was used so successfully in World War II, not by the British, but the Germans. Well, I never. Now, Fuller was an open admirer of Hitler, and he attended the Führer's 50th birthday party in 1939, a leading member of Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, a friend of Ian Fleming, and a leading disciple of Aleister Crowley again. Now, in the 1930s, Fuller formed the extreme right-wing Nordic League, aka the White Knights of Britain, allegedly established by Nazi agents. However, in the 1950s, he was a member of the MI6 supported group of Russian emigres engaged in anti-communist propaganda. So the MI6 had Russian people engaging in anti-communist propaganda. And it has been suggested that Fuller was not interned during the war with other leading fascists such as Mosley and Domville because he was an MI6 double agent. And Ian Fleming's idea was to persuade the German High Command in Berlin, and especially Rudolf Hess, that when war broke out, the Link had not disbanded but had gone underground. And it was allegedly regrouped and recruited with even more prominent pro-Nazi members in the British establishment, including aristocrats and royalty. Remember, the British royalty are German. The Queen is German, not British. Saxe, Gotha, Coburg. They changed the name to Windsor during World War I because of Britain being at war with Germany. And the people thought that was a conflict of interest, and they changed the name to one of the royal houses, which is called Windsor. Again, using fake names, all very prominent in the elite circles. Now, these were represented by the NID as influential people with the political muscle to overthrow the Prime Minister or Crime Minister Winston Churchill's national wartime government, call a ceasefire and agree to a peace treaty with Germany. And under its terms, Britain would keep control of its empire and Germany would have free reign in occupied Europe. Now, the Nazis also hoped that British troops would be sent to fight alongside the German Wehrmacht and the SS against the Soviet Union in a joint anti-communist crusade. And Hitler did not want to invade or occupy Britain. Instead, he would have preferred to negotiate a treaty with a sympathetic new government in London, and it is also being suggested that the only reason the Führer abandoned Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of southern England, and instead invaded the Soviet Union, was to force Churchill, who was a Rothschild, to accept peace terms. And if the Red Army had been defeated, Britain would have truly been standing alone, as Hitler did not believe the Americans had the political will to enter the war, until the Rothschilds interjected again. And unfortunately, he underestimated the ability and resolve of the Soviets to defend their motherland, and also the clandestine support that the US was already offering Great Britain. Now, the NID plot to ensnare Rudolf Hess used bogus astrological predictions combined with political intelligence, and Hess was persuaded that a Scottish aristocrat, the Duke of Hamilton, was willing to negotiate peace terms on behalf of influential people at the top of British society who wanted to end the war. Now, the Duke had met Hess at the Berlin Olympics in 1936. I think that was the Jesse Owens Olympics. And the Deputy Führer, for some reason, thought he was a member of the surviving Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Drake was a member of that cult. Ian Fleming commissioned an astrologer to produce a fake astrological forecast indicating that May 10th, 1941 would be a propitious date for Hess to fly to Scotland and meet secretly with the Duke of Hamilton and other members of the so-called British Peace Party. But Hess's occult advisors had also told him that there would be an unusual planetary conjunction on May the 10th. Here we go again. Conjunction with Uranus again. And on that day, 6 planets will be aligned in the zodiac of Taurus and conjoined to the full moon. There's moon rituals again. And at the same time, Hitler's chart showed malefic astrological aspects. Now, Hess saw himself in the role of a messianic hero, saving Germany from possible future defeat by making peace with the British. And all the false reports reaching the Deputy Führer about the political situation in England and the astrological aspects convinced him that his mission would be a success. So Hess flew to Scotland on May the 10th, 1941, in the firm belief that on landing he would be met by the Duke of Hamilton and the Duke of Kent, and whisked off to London for a private audience with King George VI. And he had been convinced by the misinformation fed to him by British intelligence that these 3 men represented a genuine peace movement capable of removing the warmonger Churchill and agreeing to German terms. Hess had also previously met the Duke of Windsor when he had visited Berlin before the war. Now, as a result, Hess was persuaded that some members of the German-descended royal family were sympathetic to Nazism. Certainly the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, formerly Prince Charles Edward, who was a grandson of Queen Victoria and a close friend of the Duke of Windsor, had embraced Nazism. There was a famous picture around 8 years ago in the UK that staggered most of the British people. But it was also an end to the royals' control. because there's no way that picture would have come out unless it came from higher orders, of which the British royal family are no longer part of. And what it showed was the Queen's father teaching Queen Elizabeth the Nazi Sieg Heil sign. That was the media throwing the royals under the bus. Now, Hitler had appointed him as the head of the German branch of the Red Cross, Hess, and they were responsible, the Red Cross and that group, for exterminating the mentally sick and physically disabled. Red Cross, Red Rose, Sisterhood of the Rose, Scarlet Sisterhood. The Rose line, connected to Anu, which brings in the Templars, which is connected to the Roman Catholic Church. It's all the same people. Why do you think the symbol for Switzerland, which is ran by the Rothschilds, which has a white cross with a red background? It's just the mirror version, which is also part of this mysticism and occult, the mirror. They flip it. They know what the mirror's for. And unfortunately, instead of meeting pro-Nazi aristocrats and royals when he landed, Hess was captured by a local farmer and a home guard unit, and they handed him over to the police, and he was transferred to London to be interrogated by MI5. And unfortunately, the British government completely mishandled the capture of Hess. And it has been suggested that Churchill believed the subterfuge by the NID, Naval Intelligence, and SIS, suggesting leading members of the British establishment might be pro-German, may have been based on fact. And it was. And for that reason, the government did not capitalise on Hess's peace mission. Why? Because it was all staged, is why. And yet again, these are examples of faction-based fighting for their own control, as have all wars been. The German High Command had also disowned him and said that his flight had been unauthorised, and they also suggested that Hess might be insane, for his value for pro-pagan Dar purposes was undermined and diminished. Now, Hess's apparent defection caused widespread panic in Berlin concerning the influence of occultism on the Nazi Party, and the Gestapo immediately launched Operation Action Hess. Now, on the direct orders of Hitler, they rounded up hundreds of occultists, psychics, and astrologers, including Hess's leading occult advisor, Ernst Schulte Strathaus. And in June 1941, a decree was issued banning all public performances of clairvoyance, astrology, fortune-telling, or telepathy. And anybody associated with Hess and his esoteric interest was thrown into concentration camps, and occult secret societies were closed down. Remember, Hitler also banned the Freemasons before the war started. He also banned the SS in 1933 and killed a number of them. His story won't tell you that, but From Russia with Love will. And because of staff shortages in the Gestapo, officers of the Naval Intelligence Services were drafted in to interrogate some of the arrested psychics, and it has been claimed that they recruited some of them for secret operations, using dowsing on maps with pendulums to hunt down British submarines. And it's being claimed that Ian Fleming and the NID was involved in a plot to silence the spiritualist medium Helen Duncan, the penultimate person to be charged under the Old Witchcraft Act of 1736. Now, she was arrested in 1944 after holding a séance, during which allegedly the spirit of a dead sailor from the sinking of the HMS Balham physically manifested. And as the news of the loss had not been publicly released and the Admiralty was keeping it secret for morale purposes, Duncan became a target for the security services, and she and other psychics were regarded as a serious threat to national security, which really means to cover up crimes. And they became the object of an MI5 NID dirty tricks operation to silence leaks. Now, this suggests that the intelligence services actually believed these mediums had genuine powers. No, they danced with the jinns. And Duncan's arrest and subsequent trial was in fact condemned by Winston Churchill as a waste of public funds, and was allegedly meant to deter other mediums. Now, the War Office was paranoid that military secrets about the forthcoming D-Day landings in Normandy would be revealed at séances and become public knowledge or passed to the Germans. Fear, fear, fear. And so, the summing up of that, all the royalty and leaders were duped by the occult-based peoples, all of which operate for the dark forces. Don't tell me that you are a light witch, because I will reply, you are a dark forces person. Because you, like the royals and so-called leaders down the ages, have been fooled on a massive scale, all of you. They all dance with the dark, believing you were operating in the light. But to operate in the light requires you to work on yourself. Magic is a cheat sheet and a direct line to the dark forces who operate it. And they all fell for their powers of seduction, when the lessons for covens, witches, and occult practices is to observe it, not absorb it. That way, they teach you your best lessons. But all too often, people fall for the easier path. But that is an illusion also, because it's actually the longer and the harder path. There are no shortcuts to soul development. It takes what some call the hard work. But that is an illusion also. It is the easy work. The only thing that is hard about it is standing in the truth. People too easily believe the lie, not only from others, but themselves, which is completely nonsensical. But that is because you allowed one side of your brain to dominate, generally the lower vibrational side, packed with limitations, blocks, boxes, and lower self-worth. Turn that off and merge with the higher vibrational side, and you are on the easier path to development and abilities, where you don't need magic, witchcraft, seances, potions, mantras, mandalas, or fake churches for enlightenment. No war was ever fought for freedom, for the people, or rescuing people. None. It was all about the psychopath's elites fighting for control and power, dancing with the dark forces of covens, witches, using fake science astrology mixed in with heavy occultism and mysticism. World War II, like the previous one, was a Rothschild family war, the same as the wars in America. Get the masses to fight each other for their amusement, and I'm not joking either. Lend to both sides and then collect the shekels. And Americans have to realize when they say we are fighting for freedom, it really means the elites are requesting free domain over you. Freedom is a play on words. To free up domain for the monarchs, nobles, and elites is what it means. Like the word kingdom, it means the king's domain. Domain means territory over which dominion is exerted. From dominus, which means lord, master, owner. The notion of ownership of land comes legal eminent domain, which means ultimate or supreme lordship over all property in the state. And all people were property of the state under the SWKV Act, plus the Magna Carta Act, which assigned all of Britain and its subjects over to the nobility, the black nobility operating the Catholic Church.